This is on the economics of the public sector, and what I hope to do is make a number of points about the use of economic theory in analyzing public sector activities. And so I'm going to just go down a number of, might as well make these bullet points. College students these days, since you all have extremely short time horizons and attention spans because of the internet, always want bullet points. Whenever I've gotten in the practice of requiring an oral presentation in a lot of my classes, and it's always it impresses me how the students all do bullet point PowerPoint presentations, and they just want to rattle off bullets really fast. I guess that's not only the easiest, but you don't have to really learn much. You just write down a bullet point, and then go on to the next bullet point. But so I want to make a number of points about the use of economics in analyzing the public sector. And the first thing I'll say is that what I said this morning, some of you were here at my other talk, is that it's important to understand that there are only two ways of acquiring wealth. That is participating in the market economy and producing goods and services in return for remuneration, one, or influencing politics in a way that transfers wealth from taxpayers to you, or that harms a competitor with your business, that sort of thing. And in the first case is a positive sum game. Everyone benefits from mutually advantageous trade in the market, both buyers and sellers. And with politics, it's at best a zero-sum game, a transfer from one person to the other. And that's sort of point number one. And now in terms of subsidies, government subsidies to just about everybody. I think in the United States, it's the latest number I've seen was something like 55% of all Americans get some sort of government subsidy, direct or indirect, from the government. It's probably bigger than that as far as that goes. And they never, when they have these articles in the news media, they never say anything about the harm imposed, what percentage of us is harmed by government. It's always how many of us benefit by government. But the important economic thing to remember about any kind of government subsidy is it separates remuneration from performance. Unlike in the market, when you receive money, it's usually for some sort of performance. You performed your role in producing a good or service. In fact, my old friend Walter Williams, the syndicated columnist, in his lectures, he always digs into his pocket, like I'm doing now, pulls out what he calls a certificate of performance, and this is Abe Lincoln here, for those of you who know what I'm saying. That's a good way of thinking of money, certificate of performance. You had to do something if you're working in the moral side of the economy to earn that. If you're working in the government side, in the rent-seeking side, it's not necessarily true. And so the subsidy separates money from performance. And another thing it does is it penalizes the efficient for the benefit of the inefficient. Why do we have bailouts? Well, we have bailouts because for whatever reason, the companies that are bailed out are inefficient. They're not able to compete on the market. And of course, a free market weeds these companies out so that the resources they were using can be better used by other people. But when the government subsidizes them, what they're doing is they're getting people who are, how do we know they're efficient? Well, because people voluntarily paid them for the goods and services they produce, and then the government taxes some of that money away, produced by efficient behavior, meaning behavior that contributes to the production of goods and services that people voluntarily purchase. And then the government takes the tax money and subsidizes the inefficient at the expense of the efficient. And of course, that makes the whole economy worse off or less efficient, and it prolongs the life of inefficient firms. There's some classic examples in the economic literature of one I used to use was in England when after the invention of refrigeration, at the time there were still a lot of people employed driving horses around towns and delivering milk on people's front stoops. the horse would clop its way through town, and the milkman would come and drop the milk off on your front stoop early in the morning, and you would get your milk. And of course, with refrigeration, there's no need at all for the horses and the milkman to do that. But for years and years afterwards, the British government subsidized that just because there was a lot of votes in it. And so they subsidized that grossly inefficient way of delivering milk. And an auxiliary to this point about how the life of inefficient firms is prolonged is that this creates a moral hazard problem. And most of you have probably seen this and know what a moral hazard problem is. And I've got to press the button here. Okay. It's not to be confused with Merle Haggard, the country music singer. I've had students that did that on the test, and Merle Haggard, and the Merle Haggard problem. That's when I taught in Tennessee. I had that problem. But the moral hazard, you're encouraging the behavior that you're trying to alleviate with the subsidy. When we bail out a failing firm, the bad behavior was what led to the firm's failure, and so when you subsidize that, you're sending a signal. The government is sending a signal, and they're saying, if this happens to you again, or if it happens to somebody else, in all likelihood you'll be bailed out too. So why not do the same thing? Why not be quite as efficient? Why not take excessive risks? Because if the risks don't pay off, the government will subsidize you. And in the U.S., if you remember, if you can recall some of the history of this, in the 1980s, there was said to be a third world debt crisis, but it was mostly a Citibank crisis. A lot of the big American banks had foolishly lent a lot of money to third world dictators. And so the third world dictators, of course, did what third world dictators do, and they sent the money to Switzerland, or blew it disappeared somehow. And there was said to be a debt crisis in these countries because they had these big government debts that they just had no way of paying off. And of course, the big American banks like Citibanks had bought a lot of their bonds. And so there was a big bailout by the World Bank, IMF, and of course, American taxpayers usually pony up at least about a third or so of these budgets for these bailouts. But when you think about it, the real bailout was the bailout of these banks. They took a high risk by lending money to very dubious characters, third world dictators, and as a result, they charged them very high interest. So they made the high interest, and then when the risk turned out to be a bad risk, and the dictators couldn't pay, they didn't suffer the consequences. The taxpayers suffer the consequences. So the bailouts like this socialize losses, privatize profits, and socialize losses, and that happened in the 1980s. Then in the 1990s, we had another incident in the U.S. where there was a company named Long-Term Capital that defaulted, and I think it was something like $50 billion, a very big number. And Alan Greenspan, the former Fed chairman, organized a bailout of long-term capital because supposedly some sort of worldwide calamity would occur if this firm was not bailed out. And some of us remember this quite clearly because some of the real big shots in the economics profession had left the economics academe to work for long-term capital as mathematical model builders and with options models and things like that, and including a Nobel Prize winner, but didn't work out too well for him. Should have stayed at the university, but that's what's meant by moral hazard. And then so we had the long-term capital, and then in the meantime, between the third world bailout and the long-term capital bailout, we had the savings and loan bailout. The savings and loan industry in the United States, because of government regulation, there was a government regulation in the U.S. With a very imaginative and creative name. It was called Regulation Q. And so aren't those politicians creative? And what it did is it set a ceiling on what banks, savings and loans, could pay in interest. So it's like 5%. You only pay. It was illegal for a bank to offer to pay anybody more than, say, 5% on savings. And so they could lend you money to buy your house at 10%, and competition would have driven the interest rate that you could get on your savings up above 5%. So this was sort of a cartel arrangement on the part of the S&Ls who recruited the government to hold down the cost side of their balance sheet. And but with the advent of mutual funds, where people and the advent of high inflation, also created by the government in the late 70s, people could put money into a mutual fund where they were getting 17 or 18% interest, return, whereas you can only get 5% if you put your money into savings. And so, of course, money just flowed out of the S&Ls as a result of that. And so reform was on the way. The Congress reformed the regulation of S&Ls. And one of the things they did was they increased deposit insurance. Deposit insurance was that every checking account or savings account was guaranteed for $40,000 per account. And so if a bank made bad investments with its money and ran up a big debt that it couldn't pay, the taxpayer would bail out the bank. And the Congress increased that to $100,000 per account. And so the S&L managers, the people who ran the S&Ls, looked at this and they saw, well, okay, money has been hemorrhaging from our institution. How do we survive? We have to make a big profit somehow. And so what they did was they took on a lot more risk in lending on much riskier investment projects, housing development primarily, almost exclusively, because with higher risk, there's higher potential rewards. So they could charge higher interest on loans to a retirement village in the middle of the desert in Arizona somewhere, where some developer claims people, if you build it, they will come. And they might charge the developer a very high rate of interest for the money. And so high potential. And if it goes bad, the taxpayers will pick it up, won't they? Now that the deposits are guaranteed for $100,000 rather than 40. And so that happened. A lot of the S&Ls took on infinitely more risk. And of course, the law of large numbers will tell you what's going to happen. A lot of these didn't work out. And so and that created the crisis, the S&L crisis. And so the S&Ls were bailed out. But the same message is that if you behave badly in business, don't worry about it. We'll bail you out. Long-term capital, third world debt crisis, savings and loan crisis, and then of course now with the Bush-Obama bailouts, which are many orders of magnitude greater than the rest of them. And so the bailout that occurred in the last couple of years, I think is the moral hazard. It's the realization of the moral hazard problem that economists have been predicting for 25 years because of all this previous behavior with the bailouts. Okay, and another aspect of this about subsidies is it's patently anti-consumer because if a business is failing, it's because the consumers have said we don't like what you have, and so. In a free market, that business will have to straighten up and give the consumers something they do like, or it'll be taken over most likely by somebody else in a corporate takeover, or just go bankrupt and the assets being purchased by somebody else and put to a better use. But with bailouts or subsidies, that doesn't happen. That whole market process is washed away. And I used to have a cartoon on my office door. Maybe I can draw the cartoon. It was an old Gary Larson cartoon, and there was there was a sign here, for sale, and I'll write the scribbles down here. I won't tell you what it is. And there was, standing here was a caveman. Here's a caveman. Or Martian, either one. And then over here was a disgruntled customer. That's the disgruntled customer over there, and he had longer arms than this. He had something sticking out of his head. He had something like that, and here's his hands, and it was like a little booth, like a lemonade stand over here, for sale. And there's a disgruntled customer, and the caption said, this. I'll give it a try. The caption said, early business failures, and there's the cartoon. And what it said here was porcupine on a stick. And so this guy is pulling porcupine quills out of his head. And this guy was a caveman. He looked like Fred Flintstone over here. And I had that on my office door. And I said, early examples of market success, because you don't see porcupine on a stick anymore. But you do see all these corporations that Bush and Obama have bailed out, and they're the modern version of porcupine on a stick. And they behave badly, uneconomically, inefficiently. Therefore, we reward them with billions of dollars, courtesy of the taxpayers. And so back in those days, this guy just went out of business, and he probably started selling shark on a stick at state fairs or something like that, something that people actually want, as opposed to porcupine on a stick. Another economic point about how to evaluate government with economic theory is to understand that the market is inherently cooperative. You all should know this by now. With voluntary exchange, as long as there's no fraud or force, is mutually advantageous. But by definition, the government is inherently conflictual. It inherently is conflictual because of the fact that in a democracy, we're assuming we're working in a democracy, the nature of decision making is always all or none. Either Bush gets elected president or somebody else, or either Obama or McCain gets elected president. You can't say that I voted for McCain, therefore he's going to be my president for the next 4 years, and Obama can be your president. And this is explained pretty nicely in a simple model that the public choice economists are familiar with. And it starts with a bell curve that represents the distribution of votes from left and right. In the traditional way of talking about politics, left and right. And this is, we got commies over here, Walter Block over here. And so you have your typical university faculty member right about there. And in this line here is the median. And what's underneath this bell curve is the distribution of votes according to ideology. On the far left, you have, in the tail of this distribution, you have relatively few commies. They're pretty much university professors, the mainstream media, Keith Olbermann, people like that, Barack Obama. And then on the right, you have the Mises Institute over here. But in the where you have many tens of millions in America is the middle, the median. And so, of course, there are just as many votes to the left of the median as there are to the right of the median. And this median voter model that was developed in the 50s by a political scientist named Anthony Downs and then refined by other people in the economists in the public choice area, it goes something like this. If you look at this as describing what goes on in a presidential election, then you might have one candidate staking out this position. We'll call him the Republican, R1, over there. And then here's the Democrat staking out this position, D1. And how do they do this? Well, they go on television, they make speeches, they issue press releases. They pretty much present to the country, to the voters, their philosophy of government, in a sense. They don't necessarily rattle off 1,000 public policies, but they allow people to decide, is this person or that person closer to my thinking about government, what government should be doing. And if this is the case, if you draw the midpoint between the D1 and the R1, you get the dotted line, and there's more space to the left of the dotted line than to the right of the dotted line. Therefore, the Democrat would win. But if the election is not held for another 2 months, what's likely to happen? What's likely to happen is the Republican will start bragging about how much he or she is willing to increase welfare spending, okay, or socialized medicine or something like that. And so the Republican will stake out this position. Call it R2, right there. And so, and now if you look at the midpoint between D1 and R2, you get something like this dotted line. And so if that's what you get, then there's more area to the right of that dotted line, and to the left, the Republican would win. So the median voter essentially says whoever does the best job of positioning themselves as middle of the road or at the median will win the election. And this is said to explain such things as the landslide when Lyndon Johnson won in a landslide over Goldwater. Goldwater was perceived as being way out here in the right wing. When Reagan won 49 out of 50 states, Jimmy Carter was perceived as, and the Democrats were perceived as being way over here in the left wing somewhere. And so that's what the model is used to explain. But for the purpose of what I just said about how politics is inherently conflictual, what it means is that whether this is the national election or if this is how local politics works, it means that you only get an all or none choice. You know, this could be the vote on a policy, on the, should we spend more money on public schools or something like that. But if you get the median result, you create what are called political externalities. That's what that was a phrase coined by James M. Buchanan, political externalities, meaning the people here on the left part of the bell curve are unhappy because they want government to get bigger, but it can't for the time being. People over here on the right side of the bell curve, they want government to be much smaller, but it can't get much smaller. You're getting the median. That's what you're getting. You're getting George Bush or Barack Obama, maybe, whoever's in the middle. And so you create unhappiness all around by definition. Whereas in the marketplace, if I like Diet Coke and you like Diet Pepsi, no problem. We can each get what we want. But in politics, you can't always get what you want. Maybe that's what that Rolling Stones song is about. I don't know. But by definition, it was it's all or none decision making in politics. And so, if you want your kids to pray in school, there's constantly in this country arguments over that. Should there be prayers in school? Should there be silent prayers in school? It's inherently conflictual. It's never ending, and it never will end. If you send your kid to a private religious school if you want them to pray, that's what you have to do. But if you send them to public schools, there will always be conflict because it's public schools, and it's determined by democracy. It's not determined by anything else. And so it's inherently conflictual. And one of Murray Rothbard's favorite political philosophers was John C. Calhoun. Who wrote a great book called A Disquisition on Government. Let me read that. A Disquisition on Government, 1850. It was published. It's available online, and the Liberty Fund sells it. And he's considered to be sort of the last of the American founding fathers in terms of the philosophy that he espoused, philosophy of government. And but one of the things that Murray Rothbard quoted him in at least a dozen places was, or I can write smaller. No. I'll move slower now. One of the things Calhoun was known for is there is a libertarian theory of class conflict. It's very different from the Marxian theory of class conflict. And the libertarian theory of class conflict goes back several hundred years before Karl Marx even. It goes back at least to the French physiocrats in the 1600s. In the 1700s, and the class conflict theory with Marx was the capitalist class and the working class. With the libertarian class theory, class conflict theory, it was the net tax paying class and the net tax consuming class that were always at conflict. The net taxpayers were people who paid more in taxes to government than they got in return in any kind of benefit. The net tax consumers are people who got more benefits from government employees, for example, than they paid in taxes. And Calhoun is known for saying that this is always inevitable in any kind of democracy, and it is also inevitable that the net tax consumers will eventually outnumber and overwhelm the net taxpayers and just use the taxpayers, the productive class, as the object of plunder because they can. And Calhoun said this in the context of saying that a written constitution would never be sufficient to stop this. And he was right, of course, historically, looking at it historically. And so he was known for proposing various mechanisms that weren't really original with him. They were much more original with people like Thomas Jefferson. But, for example, giving the people of a state within the American Union the right to veto any kind of law that they thought was unconstitutional. If you listen to Tom Woods' talk about nullification, Calhoun was talking about something like that. But the idea came from his understanding of the old libertarian class conflict theory. And so he was just updating this to his time, to the 1850s. But the idea had been around for several hundred years at that point. And that's just the nature of government. It's conflictual. I guess one other kind of subsidy that has been in the news a lot in the U.S. anyway has been unemployment insurance. One of the things any economist who's ever studied labor economics knows is that this is a classic moral hazard problem. Okay, what is the problem? The problem is there are too many people unemployed. So what do? We pay people to be unemployed. And you don't really have to be an economist to understand that there's a moral hazard problem coming there, because people will be less motivated to look for that new job if you're paying them enough to remain unemployed and not to have to spend money on clothes and gasoline and the act of going to work. And so whenever the Congress does do this and increases unemployment insurance, the statistics on unemployment go up as a result. There have been a lot of econometric studies of this that have said this for many, many years. This is no big secret. And it has a disproportionate effect on certain industries too, like housing construction, where there's always a lot of seasonal unemployment, in that over time there will be more resources that will go to these industries, because this is a especially big subsidy to that particular kind of industry where there is seasonal unemployment. They don't build many houses in the upper Midwest in January, for example, in the United States. It's so cold and snowy. And so a lot of resources that would have been used in other industries get misallocated into industries like housing as a result of unemployment insurance. And that's another type of moral hazard problem to talk about. Now, another point, I'm going to talk about the incentives in government enterprises. And the way I'm going to present this is to show you my plan to reform the American grocery industry. I have a plan to reform the grocery industry. Let's see, free groceries. Well, not really free. They're single payer. That is, everybody pays a grocery tax one time a year. I don't know, what, $4,000, $5,000, something like that. But when you go to the grocery store, you can just take what you want. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we have a menu for this evening's dinner outside that you can sign up for that. Okay. Okay. Single payer. So we pay that in the tax. Everyone is paid the same. This is my plan, remember. Everyone, that is, all the employees of the grocery store are paid the same, basically. We'll adjust it for seniority. I mean, everyone who's been there for 10 years gets paid more than everyone who just got hired last week. But in that range, and for doing the same job, you're there 10 years, you get paid the same. The butcher gets paid the same as the checkout clerk in the grocery store. We have to have bailouts because it's important. Food. We can't have people not have access to food. And so if the grocery store allows the vegetables to rot and the milk to go sour and the meat to turn green, well, we need to raise taxes and buy more food because people have to eat. We can't do that. Then we'll have assignment. That is, everyone is assigned to the nearest grocery store. So if you live here, if you live next door to the Mises Institute, you would be assigned maybe to that Kroger's that's down the road, not too far from here. That's your grocery store. You can walk in there anytime you want to and take whatever you want out of there. Okay. Let's see. Okay, and the final part of my reform of the grocery industry would be vicious attacks on taxpayers. If we say, gee, we've spoiled all the meat and the vegetables are rotten, and the taxpayers get together and say, we've had enough of this, we're not going to pay more taxes, well then the government would organize vicious attacks on taxpayers, saying they're cold and heartless and in favor of starving out babies, things like that. So this is my ideal reform of the grocery industry. And so when you put these things down, and I do this like in a college classroom, I ask the class if anybody recognizes this set of incentives and what industry it actually does describe out there. And I once had a student from Taiwan who just blurted out communism, and he was right. He was right. It's basically free groceries, single payer. Well, it's education, public schools. The single payer, the school, free public education. Teachers are all paid the same by category. And so, the math teacher doesn't make much more than the gym teacher. And as a result, if you have, in the market, in the private sector, if you have a shortage of math teachers, how do you deal with that? Well, you pay math teachers more. But the unions won't allow you to do that in the public schools. And so what do? You get the gym teacher to try to teach math. And that happens a lot in the United States. My whole life I've heard stories of this sort of thing going on. And of course, bailouts, perpetual bailouts. There's never enough money for public schools. And in Baltimore, what's the number? The latest number I heard, the Baltimore city schools are really, really horrible. They have something like a 12% graduation rate or something like that. 12 or 15% of the kids who start actually get a degree, and a lot of them with a degree are functionally illiterate anyway. And the latest number I heard, I think they spend something like $12,000 to $15,000 per student, somewhere in that range, which is, you could pay tuition at a pretty decent private Catholic school in that city for a lot less than that. And that doesn't even count capital cost. And of course, everyone's assigned to the local public school. You do that. And the vicious attacks on taxpayers, anytime they resist more taxes for public schools, well, you're against the children, aren't you? You're a child hater if you're into that. And that's, Friedrich Bastiat wrote about that in his famous essay, The Law, where, 1848, he was writing that the socialists of his day in France had the tactic of, if he wrote this in the law, that if you oppose their particular plan to help the poor, then they would immediately accuse you of being against the poor. You hate the poor. And it's not, they would say, it's not that you think their plan won't work or will be counterproductive, but you're anti-poor. And so even, 160 years ago, Bastiat was recognizing exactly what still happens today. That's always been the tactic of socialists, to claim that you're against humanity if you're against socialism of one form or another. So this of course would guarantee, bad performance, constant shortages, cost overruns, and so forth. Another aspect, another economic point about how to analyze business. Whenever governments start to screw up, as they always do, like they would in my grocery example, there's always somebody who makes the case that, well, we need to run government and make it more business-like. Every president of the United States does this. I think Obama was actually just at some conference where they were talking about this. Just last week I read about it. And during the Reagan administration, my old friend Jim Bennett at George Mason was actually on a committee, a White House committee, to recommend how to make government more businesslike. And he accepted the invitation just because he thought he'd get some pretty nice lunches at the White House. But of course, nobody in the world, he would be the last person in the world to think that you could actually make government work more businesslike. But he just went it was kind of like a trip to the zoo, to go to these meetings. And so he sat in on the meetings and they talked a lot of baloney. And then he showed me, they sent him a real nice certificate of appreciation, framed and everything, for being on this committee. And he opened it up, and the glass in the frame was all broken, and it was chipped, and it was all, typically what you'd expect to get from government. So this was a committee to help government produce better quality products, and the first thing they produced was this crappy broken glass certificate of appreciation that they sent to the people on the committee. But they all do that. But the fatal flaw in this idea that government could be made to be businesslike is that no real business gets its money from the taxpayers, of course. No matter how much you do this. When I lived in Tennessee, the Tennessee Valley Authority hired a man named Marvin Runyon to be the head of it, and he had been the president of Nissan USA. And so he was a real businessman. I think he came from Ford Motor Company before that, and he was successful there. He was successful at Nissan. And so they said, we're going to put Marvin Runyon in charge of the Tennessee Valley Authority, a government electric power agency, and make it run more businesslike. And they had all sorts of things. They had a board of directors like a business does. They had board meetings, and they made it on the outside. He made it look just like a business operates, but of course they got massive subsidies, hidden and direct from the government, and no free market business does that. So it's really farcical to think that government could ever be like a business. And as Murray Rothbard often pointed out, that if it's really desirable for government to be businesslike, well, why not privatize it and make it a business? What's all the talk about, let's have a board of directors like corporations do? Well, we'll sell it. Sell the Tennessee Valley Authority and let it try to compete with Duke Power and these other companies. If you really want it to be businesslike, make it a business. But you hear that all the time, businesslike government. Every president has some commission to do that. What did Al Gore call it? Al Gore called it the Reinventing Government Initiative. Yeah, they reinvented government. He was in charge of that. That's before he became a sexual predator, I guess, Al Gore. He was reinventing government. I guess he was too busy reinventing government to hit on female masseuses like he's... If you've been in America for a while, you've been reading about this, Al Gore. Another point that I wrote down here is that, I mentioned this morning in my talk this morning, is that because government confiscates all of its money, that's how it gets money, it confiscates it from the taxpayers, it spends it pretty freely on just about everything, including salaries. And I guess I threw that paper out. I had something this morning. It was an article from a recent newspaper article. The Bureau of Labor Statistics in the U.S. Let out these numbers that I think I can still remember pretty close to what it was. In the U.S., the average federal government employee makes $119,000 a year. The average private sector was $59,000. So double federal employees. And then the average benefits, health insurance, paid vacation and everything of the federal employee was $40,000 a year on top of that. Whereas in the private sector, the average benefit package is worth $9,000. And so you had $160,000 a year in salary and benefits for the average federal bureaucrat, and roughly $69,000 to $70,000 for the average private employee, and that's federal. I do have some numbers. These are pretty small. You might not be able to see this. I better just write it down instead. This is also from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it looks like this: total compensation, state and local, state and local government, private sector, and then let's call this A and this B, and this is A over B. And here's the numbers. This is hourly compensation, total compensation per hour for state, 39.66. Private sector, so the ratio is 1.45. So in the state and local government, the average bureaucrat makes 1.5 times what the average private sector worker makes, according to the U.S. government. And that's a good illustration of the point that is also made by Murray Rothbard in Power and Market, when he talks about government, that since the state confiscates its money from us, it spends it pretty freely on itself, doesn't it? And so that's the situation of things. And I've been blogging on Lew Rockwell in the last week. There was this really extreme example of this, of a city manager in a tiny town called Bell, California. Have you read about that? Population 38,000. I think, and it's a very poor area. A lot of Hispanic immigrants live there, blue collar, and I think what the per capita income is something like $12,000. Very poor. The city manager was being paid $800,000 a year, and all the bad publicity. Somebody found out about this. I don't know who it was that found out, but somebody found out about this, and holy cow! The average family makes $24,000 a year in California, which is not a cheap place to live. And then here's the city manager of this tiny little town making $800,000 a year, and so he was forced to resign. He resigned, but he is vested in a government pension that will pay him for the rest of his life $700,000 a year, every year for the rest of his life, and it's all legal. They're not going to challenge it because it's a contract. It's a legal contract, and so these people in Bell, California, will be paying this guy $700,000 a year for as long as he lives. And he's only, I think, he's 53 or something like that right now, and so. Somebody, when I blogged about this, some accountant sent me an email saying, if you want to find out about this in every city in America, here's what you ask them for. You don't ask them for the budget or anything. There's some other kind of document that they all have where all the salaries are listed, and I forget the exact name of it now. But it's, if you're a sort of a government accounting type, you know what this is. And I didn't want to have a third career doing that, so I haven't done anything in that regard. But this is probably, I'm guessing, is not atypical in California, especially, that this happens. And so that's another point that of how things happen in the government. Another point about the economics, what economics has to say about government, is that whenever the government takes over an industry or even a business or something like the Tennessee Valley Authority, as you know, since you've had the lectures on the calculation debate, you know that what they do is often just sort of random decision making, not based on the market. It's just based on command and control. And so, a big entity like the Tennessee Valley Authority can command and control a tremendous amount of resources, electricity in the whole Tennessee Valley. And so the way Murray Rothbard put it is they introduce islands of chaos into the economy. So we still have a lot of capitalist enterprises around, but you have this big monster here gobbling up resources using people and as employees and raw materials to do what it does. But what it's doing is not guided by the market very well. It's guided by bureaucratic directives. And so the way Rothbard put it is that they tend to introduce islands of chaos in the market economy. Another aspect, another bullet point here that Rothbard wrote about, that's really you really see it today a lot, is that governments always monopolize what Rothbard called the command posts of the economy. it always makes sure that it monopolizes the command posts. What are these command posts? It's telecommunications, the roads, the rivers and the harbors, and all that sort of thing. Education is always monopolized, and so it has to crowd out all the private sector activity in all these areas because that's how it controls the population. The post office, it has to control how we communicate, how we travel, how we educate ourselves, and how we can get into and out of the country. That's how it keeps itself in power, by monopolizing all these things. And of course, anytime the government gets involved in any business at all, it crowds out private businesses. It doesn't only siphon resources away from taxpayers to do what it's doing, but it often gets into things that legitimate private businesses do, like electricity production, for example. Back when I used to do research on local governments, there was a book called the International City Management Association Yearbook. Every year they'd publish a sort of a handbook if you're a city manager, like the $800,000 a year man in Bell, California. And every year they would have a table of a survey of all the things city governments did, everything from leaf raking to sewage plants, all the things they do. And then they would list what percentage of these things are done by the private sector somewhere. And every single function had a positive percentage. In other words, every single thing local governments do is also done by the private sector somewhere, and done much better, by the way, and much cheaper and better quality. And so you can make the case that every single thing the local government does, education, street cleaning, garbage collection, all these things, there's no market failure there. There's no free rider problem keeping us from an adequate supply of any of these things. It's just monopolistic control. And I've reprinted those tables in some of the books I've published over the years, but it did not lead to a privatization crusade or anything like that. But it does make the point that they do crowd out private businesses. The guy in my neighborhood who has the private garbage truck, he has to compete with the county and the city who run their own garbage collection departments. How easy is that? Or schooling, of course. It's hard to start up a private school when the public schools, everyone, their salaries and everything are paid for by the taxpayers. And so that's another point, the crowding out point. Okay, and maybe I'll quit for there on my points, and we'll have some time for if anybody has any questions or brilliant declarations that you'd like to make, anything like that. If you'd like me to tell you the questions on the exam, along with the answers, I could do that too.
I can share another example of states overpaying wages. Up in Pennsylvania, our liquor is controlled by the state, and the liquor store cashiers are retiring. Their retirement is based on the last 3 years of their earnings. They work overtime, 60 hours a week.
Yeah.
They're retiring, making like $70,000 a year, which is guaranteed by the state then. And the state's almost bankrupt, all local governments are almost bankrupt, and that's not even on the table to stop it.
Yeah, that's true everywhere. It's true where I live in Baltimore too. The police are like that. It seems like they all have that gig in America. If you're a public employee, your retirement is like 80% of what you made on the last year. And so your last year of work, if you're making $60,000 a year, you'll make maybe $100,000 for 1 year the last year, and then get $80,000 a year for the rest of your life. Yeah, well that like you said, that's bankrupting everybody, so that's not going to last. There's just not the money for that sort of thing. But yes, sir, you had a hand up next.
Most of the states are broke right now, so what do you think they're going to do?
They're lobbying Obama to bail them out, courtesy of Ben Bernanke. That's what they're going to do. The Fed will bail them out. What has restrained Bernanke from bailing anybody else out? He printed up $1 trillion in 1 day not too long ago. $1 trillion. And then when Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York City, sued the Fed to find out who got the money, they refused to tell him, and he won the lawsuit, but it's being appealed. And so it's been about 2 years now since this happened. And so if the Fed can print up $1 trillion, and then when a taxpayer says who gets the money, they say that. that's why wouldn't they do it again? Why wouldn't they do it again? So that's what's going to happen. The Fed will bail them out. That's why Ron Paul wants the Fed to be audited. We don't know these things. Where does this money go? You might remember also during the Iraq War, some of you might have seen pictures where the U.S. government sent giant pallets of $100 bills to Iraq to stimulate the Iraqi economy, and they all just kind of disappeared. No one knows what happened. These big pallets of $100 bills this high, that they had to carry around with bulldozers, and they disappeared. What a shocker that they disappeared. But where'd that money come from? Well, the Fed, we suspect. Anyway, I can't prove it beyond all doubt, but I think that's probably what the Fed was up to. Yes, sir.
I have a friend who's, she's a Marxist and all kinds. But
why didn't you bring her here? She might no longer be your friend if you brought her here. Yeah.
Well, so she was telling me how she's working for this campaign to lobby our local government to allocate stimulus funds that's already been given to our local government to do what they will with this, I guess. And the scheme is they're going to make low interest loans to people to equip their houses with solar panels and then pay back the government at interest. And obviously I tried to explain, some basic business cycles, how they can cause the artificial criminally disaster anyway. And she was saying, well, they already have the money, so they got to spend it on something. And I gave the best answer that I could about where the money come from and what distortion is this going to cause. But is there anything that you would add to what the effects of a policy like that would be? The economics tells you that you're creating unemployment in a lot of other places because there's the opportunity cost of spending money on solar panels or whatever they're spending it on is what it would have been spent on had it been in the pockets of the taxpayers and kept there in the first place. And so that's I mentioned Friedrich Bastiat, his famous essay, "What is Seen and What is Not Seen," is what you need to get her to read and understand or teach her, because that's, the economic way of thinking is just that. To be an economist, that's the first thing you need to do is understand that, you see the expenditure on a government program, but what you don't see is what the money would have been spent on. For example, during the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt employed about 10 million people in public works jobs, but the unemployment rate still was 14 and 15% at the end of the 1930s. All they did was create unemployment in the private sector, and then the government gave people government jobs. So what is seen was the government jobs, but what was not seen was all the destruction of jobs in the private sector. But if you study economics, you understand that has to be true. They had to destroy jobs in the private sector. And if I could just ask for one more clarification. One thing that she was saying is this money is already allocated to our government, and this is just what, this is the best thing we think that they could do with it. And realistically, it is already allocated, but what could I say to her? Well, it would be better if they did this with the money that's already been spent.
Well, like I said, democracy is inherently conflictual. That's an example of how it is. I don't think there's anything you could say. It's all subjective, isn't it? You could say the money would be much better spent if it was all given to you, which it probably would be. Solar panel. It's. And another thing, all this business about, subsidizing the poor for solar panels now, and all that is something to make environmentalists feel good about themselves. It's not going to have any effect on global warming. We're going to cool off the planet by having 100 low-income people in your neighborhood put big chunks of glass on the roofs of their houses. What's that about? And so of course there'll be somebody who sells that stuff who I'm sure is lobbying very vigorously with the environmentalists, and that's always what happens. The economists call this the bootlegger and Baptist strategy. During Prohibition, bootleggers and Baptists were political partners. The Baptists did not want alcohol for obvious reasons, for religious reasons, and the bootleggers did not want legal sale of alcohol either because they were making money illegally selling the alcohol. And so you often see that. You often see the fanatic, like your girlfriend, teaming up with some businessman trying to rob the treasury, and using her as cover, using the, I'm surprised there's not a priest involved. There's usually some local minister, ministering to the poor by being involved in this sort of thing. They often do that. Yeah. So they want people to think it's the will of God to put these solar panels up, and to pay this guy $1 million to do it. Yeah. That's. But we have time for a couple more, I guess. Yes, sir.
If they end up bailing out the states, it will actually be a very undue representation. Because if you look at the top 10 worst off states by percentage of debt per GDP, it's 8 of them are northeastern states, and then California, and the other 2 are Alaska. It's either Nebraska or Montana. So basically, 8 out of the 10 are very liberal states spending a lot of money.
Yeah.
The government spends so much money that the percentage debt per GDP is much higher than what they actually report. But when and many times it's like 5 to 10 times more than the top 10 better off states, which are all red. So because of this, the middle America and basically the southeast and the north, basically Texas, and northwest are going to be paying for California and the northeastern states instead.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. I'll recommend one more book. There's a book that's related to this. It's called The Political Economy of the New Deal, and the main author is William Shughart, Shughart, Bill Shughart, and it was one of his PhD students as a co-author. I forget his name now, but they did a statistical study of how Franklin Roosevelt spent the New Deal stimulus money. And one of the conclusions they came to is that the main criterion for how he spent the money was the size of his electoral margins in the previous election. So wherever margins were thin, that's who got most of the money. And so like the Deep South, the whole South was solid Democrat because Abe Lincoln was a Republican. And so it wasn't until really the 1970s and 80s that the South started voting Republican in any significant numbers. So in the 1930s, Roosevelt didn't have to worry about subsidizing Mississippi, even though that's where the Great Depression was worse in Mississippi than anywhere else in America. But California got a lot of money, and other states where his electoral margins were thin in 32, that's who got the lion's share of the money. So it was all, and that's what Obama is doing. I'm sure if you read anything about the so-called stimulus bill that they passed, the big one that Obama passed, it was written into law that the lion's share of the money will not be spent until this year, the election year, even though the law was like a year and a half ago. And so because they know that voters don't remember, if they spend the money 2 years ago, they won't necessarily make the connection, Obama, new school building in my neighborhood. But if they do it right now, Obama, my husband has a new job building the new school building, that'll buy some votes. And so I recommend this book by Shughart and his co-author if you're really interested in how this works. And yes, sir, in the back, maybe one more question.
I was just going to make a comment about using solar panels to help the environment. In Australia, after the financial crisis hit, they, as part of the stimulus package, they had the total spend how many billions of dollars on insulation. So they started putting insulation in tens of thousands of homes. But what happened was lots of shoddy operators went into the industry and started putting in dodgy insulation, and so several houses started burning down, and people actually died. And the minister for that was Peter Garrett from Midnight Oil. So he actually got just shifted to somewhere else. But now they're going to have to spend more billions to actually go back to every one of the houses and work out, okay, was this insulation good or bad? I think they're also going to bail out some of the insulation industry because they invested a lot of money in new production lines that now I'm going to secure for.
Yeah, it's a government is one big Rube Goldberg machine, as they say. We experienced something like that in the U.S. During the energy crisis of the 1970s. It was entirely caused by the government's price controls and allocation controls. As a result of that, we had all sorts of subsidies for insulation of houses, and then we were told by the government a few years later that there was an indoor air pollution problem, because there was no circulation of air through the houses. They were so well insulated that there's a lot of fresh air. So all kind of diseases we have, and so therefore we need the government to spend more money on disease research and everything else because of the diseases it caused us to get with all of its subsidized insulation. And so this is what, the last thing I'll say is related to this. One of Ludwig von Mises' famous essays is called "Middle of the Road Policy Leads to Socialism." And he just gives quite a few examples of how interventions like this that start out and they fail, and politicians never like to admit failure, and so they'll respond to the failure with even more interventions that they hope will fix the original failure, and of course that won't work either. And so before too long, you have these massive control of a big section of the economy built up through all this intervention that might have started very modestly as something along the lines that you mentioned. And it's not a real long essay either. And so I recommend that one. And our time is about up. Thank you.